Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for our quarterly webinar, where my colleagues and I will be discussing our latest research. My name is Nicole Kozłowski, and I'm the head of engagement here at Planet Tracker. And as always, we have quite a packed and diverse agenda for today, and we're happy to see so many of you dialing in for this session. What we're going to do in the next 30 minutes is we will discuss some of our latest research that we have published. So what we will be looking at is, for one, we're going to look into the future of China's distant water fishing fleet and why it matters to investors. We will also discuss the risks and impacts of artificial chemicals and why it is financially material. And lastly, we will have a look at our latest report in our climate transition analysis range, examining bias climate transition strategy. Before we kick it off, I just want to do some very quick housekeeping. If you have any questions, please add them in the Q&A or in the chat below. We will try and pick up a few here and answer them either online or in the chat. And if we cannot get back to you during the webinar, we will make sure that we'll reply via email later on. And also to note that all of the reports which will be discussed today will also be shared with you in the chat, so you don't have to look for them online. We'll make sure to share everything with you. And then lastly, this webinar will be recorded and will be made available for other participants to see online later on. So let's kick it off. Before we dive straight into our research, I just wanted to take 1 minute to introduce Planet Tracker to those of you who aren't familiar with our work. Planet Tracker is a sustainable finance think tank conducting research on nature-related risks and opportunities. And we focus on the drivers of biodiversity loss, specifically land and sea use change, exploitation of natural resources, pollution, and climate change. We provide in-depth research reports on each of these topics, covering a range of industries and themes, as you can see on the slide here. We are a not-for-profit, so everything that we do is for the common good, and all our research is publicly available on our website and or on your usual financial data platforms. And with that being said, let's dive straight into the webinar. The first piece of research we want to talk about is our latest report on the future of China's distant water fishing fleet and why it matters to investors. With me is my colleague François Monnier, who is the head of our Ocean program. And François, we're happy to have you here, and over to you.
Thank you, Nicole, and hello, everyone. Today, I'll present you a case study, really, of how finance could help a nature-dependent industry that struggles to overcome its financial, environmental, and social challenges. Now, this industry is the Chinese distant water fishing fleet, meaning the close to 2,500 fishing vessels owned by Chinese companies that fish outside of Chinese waters. And you might wonder, why do we focus on them? If we want healthy ecosystems and a healthy climate, we need a healthy ocean. Overfishing is a key reason behind ocean health degradation, and no country catches more seafood than China. You might also think that you're not exposed to the Chinese distant water fishing fleet as an investor or lender, but chances are that you are actually. It produces more than 2 million tons of seafood a year and supplies food manufacturers and food retailers such as Walmart, Thai Union, Amazon, Mitsubishi, Carrefour, etc., etc. This means that international financial institutions are indirectly or directly exposed to this industry, the same way they are exposed to deforestation via their agriculture or food retail investment. Now, the problem is that this industry is not doing well, despite generating at least 45% of its profit from subsidies. And that means it's often blamed for treating its crew badly, and the marine life it relies on to generate revenue even worse. And this is also visible from the numbers. When you look at the gross margins generated by companies in this fleet, it is clear that the industry cannot possibly pay decent salaries and operate profitably at the same time. So overall, the fleet is not doing well. Like I said, with an average 14% gross margin based on our analysis of close to 1,500 vessels. There is an exception though, and that is for tuna. This chart shows you the breakdown of tuna profit pool by area, and it compares it to how sustainable these areas are. Now, ignore all the complexity of the chart, but what you can see is that the biggest chunk of the profits is made in the most sustainably managed fisheries. Tuna species are not overfished in area FAO 71. That's the big bar on the right, which is the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. And because they're not overfished, you have biomass levels that are high and profits that are high too. And that is an evidence of the financial materiality of seafood sustainability. Now, sadly, the problem is that this area is also among the most exposed to climate change. So these profits will shrink and the fleet will have to find new places to fish. And there's more in the report on that, including how this could lead to more unregulated activity as the fleet is pushed further in less monitored waters, and how it could even foster collaboration between African countries to ensure their natural capital is not even more exploited by foreign fleets, including the Chinese one. So what does it all mean for investors? If you hold equities in food retail or food producers, it means that checking your exposure to the Chinese distant water fishing fleet is important. Engaging with companies to invest in traceability and transparent sourcing is a way to reduce your risk. But honestly, that won't be enough to solve the problems of the Chinese fleet. State intervention is needed. Currently, subsidies are only very mildly linked to sustainability, and this needs to change. We detail how subsidies should be calculated in the report. Once this is done, for China to make a U-turn and become a global blue leader, all of its vessels need to be traceable and monitored. And this could be financed via a sovereign blue bond of about 5.5 billion renminbi in our estimates, which is $800 million roughly. And so if you invest in Chinese debt, please have this sort of discussions. This would literally benefit everyone, from the banks that work on this issuance to the companies that would benefit from a boost in their image to the people working on these vessels, of course. It might be optimistic, but with all the power of the engagement of financial institutions, I'm sure it won't be wishful thinking.
Thank you, Francois, and a great way to bring the report title back into that. We have received a few questions on that, actually, and there's one thing that I would like to start with, and that is about the ownership. Who owns these Chinese distant water fishing fleets, and is it mainly owned by the government?
Yeah, it's a fair point and something I hear quite often. And to be honest, the answer surprised us. So we tracked 1,446 vessels and mapped each of them to their owners. And we found 147 owners. And out of these 147 organizations, 3 are privately controlled but listed companies. 26 are state-owned or state-controlled, and 118 are privately owned unlisted companies. So the vast majority is privately owned companies. And they are different in terms of species. State-owned enterprise control at least half of tuna production, which is more profitable than the average. And squid, in contrast, is typically owned by private entities and not doing well financially.
Interesting. And can I ask you about motivation as well? Why would these companies agree to operate more sustainably? Because oftentimes it is associated with cost. Wouldn't it be more costly for them?
Yeah, so I think the first point is that the current situation is not sustainable, right? The industry makes low margins. Subsidies are going to come down once the WTO agreement enters into place, and climate change is shrinking the key profit pool. So something needs to be done. Now, the Chinese government has recently encouraged companies to act more sustainably, but definitely not enough. And depending on whether and how subsidies are rebalanced to encourage more traceability, more transparency, and generally more sustainable behavior, the fleet could actually see its profits improve.
That's very encouraging to hear. Thank you so much, Francois. We're now going to move on to our next speaker. With me is Chris Baldock. He's the head of our data team, and he will discuss our latest report on artificial chemicals and the risks associated with it. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Nicole. So let me quickly introduce you to what novel entities are and why they're an issue for corporates and their financiers. So novel entities are substances made by humans that do not naturally exist in the environment, and they include synthetic chemicals and plastics. The introduction of novel entities represents one of the 9 planetary boundaries, which relate to key processes that regulate the stability of the Earth system and the limits we must stay below in order to maintain a healthy planet. Now, there is a huge stock of novel entities in production and use, and the list is growing. A new chemical is registered every 1.4 minutes. 350,000 chemicals are registered for production and use in the EU and North America alone. And 80% of the chemicals in the EU's chemical database called REACH, which have been in use for at least the last 10 years, have not undergone a proper safety assessment. Now, most of the impacts are unknown, and causation is slowly being established, linking health issues from chemical exposure to the companies that use and produce them. Now, this is relevant for many sectors, from petrochemicals to agriculture to packaging, plastics, clothing, textiles, hardware manufacturing, waste disposal, and then the list goes on. It is a complex topic. There are 160 odd references in our report. It contains many real-world examples of impacts and litigation against companies. We've tried to make the report more digestible by providing 6 independent case studies. You can see the image on the right contains the list there, and they can be tackled independently. The actions for financiers at the end of each case study are linked back to our petrochemical investor statement, which we'll touch more on later. But in brief, there are a series of 5 asks of companies which provide a quick and easy way for investors to start acting in this area. Now, in terms of our findings, a brief overview, we don't really know much at all about how chemicals impact environmental health, human health, or planetary boundaries, which should be a worry for companies and their financiers. And litigation from that will start to hurt companies financially, and it already has. So recently, Bayer has paid out 13 billion euros in the last 5 years. 3M will have to pay $10 billion over the next 13 years, and Chemours, DuPont, and Corteva were ordered to pay $1.9 billion in June of last year, all in cases relating to chemical exposure and the impacts on the environment and human health. And in addition, BASF has been named as a defendant in 1,200 lawsuits relating to the human health impacts caused by exposure to a type of chemical called PFAS. Asia and China in particular are responsible for the rapid growth in petrochemical production, which is far outpacing our capacity to carry out proper safety assessments. As I mentioned, PFAS, or forever chemicals, are a type of chemical that are in the spotlight, not only because of their usefulness in industry, but due to their damaging and long-lasting impact in the environment and on human health. And as such, over 100 companies have signed up to the PFAS movement, which is run by ChemSec, and it includes the signatories such as Inditex and H&M, which calls for a ban on the use of PFAS. There's also an issue of plastic waste, which counts as a novel entity, which is increasingly an issue for companies like Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and Nestle, which are being linked to the growing quantity of plastic waste in our oceans. So the risks are many, and the list is constantly growing. So what are the key takeaways for investors, the financiers, and actions that you can take? So what can you do if you're concerned about these issues? So lenders can introduce lending criteria so that they are not linked to the production and use of these toxic chemicals. Shareholders can pressure management teams to transition to sustainable alternatives. Insurance companies can adjust premiums for companies that manufacture and use the most toxic chemicals. And financial institutions can also sign up to Planet Tracker's petrochemical statement and engage with companies effectively. So what is the petrochemical investor statement? So this statement calls on petrochemical companies to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels and eliminate hazardous chemicals in plastics. So far, we have 73 investors representing assets of about $6.8 trillion who have supported the statement, and they're asking petrochemical companies to do 5 things. In general, are transparently disclosing their plastic-related impacts, adopting sustainable practices and infrastructure for the production of sustainable materials, establishing board-level responsibility to achieving sustainability commitments, and then supporting a legally binding global plastics treaty to address plastic pollution. The statement remains open for investors to join until mid-November. and which is before the final round of the Global Plastics Treaty negotiation. So please see our website or get in touch with us if you'd like to learn more. And with that, I can take any questions and hand over to Jon for climate transition analysis.
Thanks so much, Chris. There really is so much information on novel entities that I guess it can be a little bit overwhelming. So my first question is, how can investors get a better grip on this topic?
So yeah, it can definitely be overwhelming. And so what we've tried to do is simplify the report into these 6 case studies, as I mentioned. They can be read independently, so have a look to see which one is potentially the most relevant for you. Everything also comes back to a central pillar, which is our Petchem investor statement, which contains 5 very simple asks for companies to do. So it doesn't take all of the thinking out of it for financiers, but it does a lot of the work. And so I would point to those 2 things.
Yes, makes it a bit more digestible. And then, anyone who has been following the news has probably seen quite a bit on PFAS recently, so on forever chemicals, and we're seeing more and more of it. Do you think that's the next big thing in the space to watch?
So we do have one case study specifically on PFAS and the impacts that it causes and the litigation that we're seeing at the moment. It could be the next big thing that we see in this area. As we mentioned, there's been litigation against Bayer, 3M, Chemours, DuPont, Corteva, and BASF, all relating to the use or improper management of PFAS. So, and as mentioned in the introduction, these chemicals are contained in a variety of products across sectors. So they're very useful in terms of their non-stick or resistant properties. So they're found in kitchenware, they're found in clothing, in textiles. So it's relevant for many sectors and many financiers.
Thanks so much, Chris. And maybe just to mention on the side as well, because we've highlighted the petrochemical investor statement. Last week, the state of California has announced that they're bringing forward a lawsuit against ExxonMobil and linking them to plastic pollution, which is the first time a US state is doing it, linking a petrochemical company to the plastic pollution. So that's definitely also something to watch. Thanks a lot, Chris. Let's move on to our last presentation of today. My colleague Jon Wisniewski will discuss our latest company analysis and our climate transition analysis range. Jon, we're happy to have you here, and over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as many of you may be aware, this year we are once again assessing the climate transition plans of chemical companies from the CA 100 list. And as a refresher, our assessment framework, as shown on the left-hand side, is based on 4 critical pillars. So we have climate alignment, a backward-looking metric, and 3 forward-looking metrics, namely policy and governance, risk, and strategy analysis. So while the climate alignment looks at how the company's emissions evolved historically and how would this compare going forward with the level recommended by science-based targets, the other 3 assess the company's initiatives to change that historical trend. So as Nicole was mentioning, today I'll provide you a summary of our findings on Bayer Climate Transition Plan. And we are starting with the key 3 issues we identified in Bayer's climate commitments. Firstly, there are some notable discrepancies between Bayer's climate goals and those of its trade associations. So while Bayer aims for reasonably ambitious climate goals, some of its affiliated trade bodies like the German Chemical Industry Association or the Federation of German Industries are less ambitious when it comes to climate commitments, or even against some of the related policies. So this misalignment, in our view, raises concerns about the consistency of Bayer climate advocacy. And secondly, there are also gaps in the downstream emissions mitigation disclosures and the effectiveness of its consumer engagement initiatives. So despite efforts to encourage sustainable practices among its customers, Bayer needs, in our opinion at least, to provide more robust data on emissions reductions, especially regarding those from the use of goods sold as well as outcomes from its customer engagement actions in particular. And lastly, Bayer announced key strides in climate risk management, but there are gaps when it comes to detailed disclosure on financial impacts of climate risk and the specific capital expenditure needed for their mitigation. And without this transparency, to be fair, stakeholders are left with questions about the financial robustness of Bayer's transition strategy. Now, moving to our key findings, Bayer has set a target for net zero emissions by 2050, and it has interim targets of reducing operational emissions by 42%, meaning scope 1 and scope 2, and upstream scope 3 emissions by 12.3% by 2030. And this commitment, it shows high ambition, but there are certain limitations to it. For example, Bayer has committed to a 500 million investment in renewable energy and efficiency projects, which supports its operational emissions reductions. However, the plan for scope 3 emissions, upstream and downstream, lacks the same level of detail and, of course, lacks the disclosure of investment in those initiatives. And without that, our scenario-based analysis suggests that Bayer's trajectory is more closely aligned with 2 degrees warming scenario by 2030 rather than the more ambitious 1.5 Paris Agreement pathway, which we believe the company should be aiming for. And our last slide, when it comes to investor takeaways. So from an investor perspective, there are 3 critical takeaways from our assessment. First, Bayer must develop and disclose specific and measurable initiatives to reduce scope 3 emissions. And this includes outlining the investments tied to these efforts, ensuring the alignment with its net zero climate goals, especially also the interaction with trade associations, because without addressing scope 3 emissions, we believe Bayer risks missing its interim targets. Then we also recommend a robust monitoring and adjustment mechanisms to implement in order to ensure a continuous and sustainable greenhouse gas reduction. Because if something were to happen, there's no plan B at the moment, and Bayer needs a clear process to evaluate and adjust its strategy, ensuring that its transition remains on track despite potential external challenges or even internal setbacks. And finally, there is an urgent need for Bayer to enhance its transparency by providing more detailed monetary disclosure on financial impacts, especially when it comes to climate risks and also specific investments required for mitigation of its greenhouse gas footprint. And we do believe this level of detail is a must for investors to fully understand the financial health and long-term viability of Bayer's climate strategy. So highly encouraged. Concluding, while Bayer has made some progress towards more sustainable practices, particularly when it comes to operational emissions, so scope 1 and 2, more specifically when it comes to renewable energy investments, there are still areas for improvement. And as I was saying, we encourage investors and shareholders alike to closely watch how Bayer assesses these gaps to ensure its climate transition plans remains credible and ultimately feasible. Thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions that came through.
Thanks, Jan. Maybe one question that has come up is, could you highlight what the main reason is why Bayer isn't on track to meet its 2030 goal of aligning with the 1.5 degree scenario?
So I would say the lack of disclosed capex around sustainability goal and mitigation incentives is a key deterrent to its credibility of achieving that 1.5 ambitious goal. Because while the company initiatives, as I was mentioning, the 500 million investment in renewable energy and efficiency might deliver on those operational emissions mitigation, by not addressing the scope 3 emissions, which make up the 75% of its total footprint, so the huge majority of its footprint, the company would not be able to align with the Paris Agreement latest ambition of 1.5. That's why we ultimately concluded that the company would align with the 2-degree scenario.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jan. Now, before we wrap up this webinar, I know we only have a couple of minutes left. I just briefly wanted to provide you with an overview of what else we have recently published and what to expect from us. In the same vein of what Jan was presenting now, we've also just recently published an update on LyondellBasell Basel. So you can find that on our website as well, and on the QR code here. Just as a reminder, we've done an analysis on a number of chemical companies as well as FMCG companies. So you find all of the climate transition analysis on our website. I also wanted to mention the shareholder engagement guide, which we recently published on petrochemical companies and plastics. The guide helps investors engage with petrochemical companies by providing strategies and resources to push for reductions in fossil fuel dependency and the elimination of hazardous chemicals in plastics. And it outlines key asks for companies, including setting sustainability targets, improving transparency, and supporting the Global Plastics Treaty, whilst also offering tools to facilitate investor-company dialogues. So you'll find that in the chat as well. And then lastly, a bit of an outlook of what's about to come out. Planet Tracker's newest report, Nature Tracking, will demonstrate the practice of nature footprinting. So assessing a company's impact on natural ecosystems. We are using Nestlé as a case study, and we analyzed supply chain disclosures for 4 key commodities. That's coffee, cacao, palm oil, and milk. And by leveraging a traceability technology from Visuality, we estimated Nestlé's environmental footprint, including deforestation, water use, and emissions related to sourcing these commodities. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And that brings us to the end of our update. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next update meeting at the end of Q4 in 2024. And as always, if you have any questions on any of the content that we have presented today, please get in touch with me. We do offer deep dive sessions into each of our reports that we publish to investors. So if that's something that you're interested in, please reach out. And with that being said, have a wonderful week and hopefully speak soon. Goodbye.